The crystalline spires of Zethera Prime glowed with an eerie blue light as Naira clutched her child closer to her chest. The Council's judgment still echoed in her mind. Exile? A single word that had shattered her entire world. She watched as the guards approached, their silver armor reflecting the harsh light of the 3 moons overhead. Kale stirred in her arms, his small fingers wrapping around the pendant at her neck, the last gift from his father before the accident, before everything changed. At 4 cycles old, he was too young to understand why they were being forced from the only home they'd ever known. Too young to comprehend that his very existence violated their society's most sacred laws. The head guard, Commander Vex, stepped forward. His face was impassive, but Naira caught the slight tremor in his hands as he presented her with the Exile Kit, a standard-issue survival pack containing basic supplies. They had served together once before her transgression, before she dared to save her child using forbidden genetic modifications. "The Council's judgment is final," Vex stated, his voice mechanical. "You have violated the pure gene protocols. The child's altered sequences cannot be permitted to contaminate our bloodlines." Naira's fingers tightened around Kale. "He was dying," she whispered, though she knew it wouldn't matter. The genetic therapy was the only way to save him. "Then perhaps he should have died." Vex's words cut through her like shards of ice. "Natural selection maintains our strength. Your interference threatens millennia of careful breeding." A small transport pod waited nearby, its systems humming with barely contained energy. It would take them far from Zetherian space, to the edges of known territory where exiles were left to survive or perish on their own. The pod was automated, pre-programmed to prevent any possibility of return. Naira stepped inside, her movements careful to avoid jostling Kale. He had fallen asleep, unaware that this would be the last time he would see the crystal spires of his birthworld. The pod's interior was sparse 2 acceleration couches, basic life support, and a small storage compartment for the Exile Kit. As the hatch began to close, Commander Vex spoke one final time. "You were one of our finest geneticists, Naira. Your work on evolutionary stability helped strengthen our species. Remember that when you look at what your weakness has cost you." The hatch sealed with a hiss, and Naira felt the pod systems engaging. Through the viewport, she watched her world shrink away, becoming just another point of light in the vast darkness. She had known the risks when she chose to save Kale, known that altering his genes to cure his genetic disorder would mean death or exile if discovered. But watching her son's illness consume him day by day, she had realized that some prices were worth paying. The pod's trajectory took them through the outer reaches of Zetherian space. Naira studied the navigation display, nodding their heading toward the frontier regions. They would be deposited on one of the designated exile worlds, harsh environments where the condemned were left to test their worth through survival. Hours passed in the cramped confines of the pod. Kale woke briefly, asking for water in his small voice. Naira helped him drink, then sang him back to sleep with an old Zetherian lullaby. She knew she should rest as well, conserve her strength for whatever challenges awaited them, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she inventoried their supplies: basic medical supplies, nutrient packs, a multi-tool, and thermal blankets. Standard exile provisions, meant to give them a fighting chance while ensuring they couldn't easily escape their fate. The pod systems would alert her when they approached their destination, but for now, all she could do was wait. As Kale slept in her arms, Naira found herself studying his face. His features were pure Zetherian, the characteristic silver-tinted skin, the delicate ridge patterns along his temples. The genetic modifications she had made to save his life were invisible to the naked eye, hidden in the complex dance of proteins and enzymes that had once threatened to stop his heart. The pod's warning system chimed, pulling her from her thoughts. They were approaching their designated planet, or rather, moon. The readings showed a frozen world, tidally locked to a gas giant. Temperatures well below freezing, thin atmosphere, minimal vegetation. A death sentence for most species. But Naira hadn't spent her life studying genetics without learning a thing or two about survival. As the pod began its descent, she wrapped Kale more tightly in his blanket and whispered, "We'll survive this, little one, whatever it takes." The pod shuddered as it hit the atmosphere, and Naira braced herself for impact. She didn't know what awaited them on the frozen surface below, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would keep her son alive, no matter the cost. Even if it meant burning everything, she had to keep him warm. The impact threw Naira forward against the pod's restraints, the force nearly causing her to lose her grip on Kale. Warning lights flashed across the console as the small craft skidded across the frozen ground, metal shrieking against ice until it finally ground to a halt. Emergency systems whined and sputtered, then died completely, leaving them in darkness broken only by the pale light filtering through the cracked viewport. Naira's first thought was for Kale. She ran her hands over him, checking for injuries, relief flooding through her when she found none. He was unconscious but breathing steadily, his small body warm against hers. The pod systems were dead, which meant the environmental controls would soon fail. They needed to move. The hatch was jammed, warped by the impact. Naira set Kale down carefully and braced herself against it, pushing with all her strength. The metal groaned, then gave way with a sudden crack that sent her stumbling into the frozen air outside. Wind whipped around her, carrying ice crystals that stung her exposed skin like tiny needles. She quickly retrieved Kale and the survival pack, knowing they had precious little time. The gas giant loomed enormous in the sky, its swirling storms casting an eerie purple glow across the landscape. Naira could already feel the cold seeping through her thermal suit, designed for short-term survival rather than extended exposure. They needed shelter. The pod was useless now, its hull breached in multiple places. Through the swirling snow, Naira spotted what looked like rock formations in the distance. Better than staying in the open. She clutched Kale to her chest and began walking, each step careful on the treacherous ice. The journey took longer than she expected. The moon's gravity was slightly higher than Zethra Prime's, making every movement more demanding. By the time they reached the rock formation, Naira's muscles were burning from exertion. What she had thought was a simple outcropping turned out to be the entrance to a shallow cave, its walls smooth as if carved by ancient ice flows. It wasn't much, but it would block the wind. Naira set Kale down gently and began unpacking their supplies. The Exile kit contained a basic heat generator, but its power cell was limited. She would need to be strategic about its use. She activated it now, though, needing to warm Kale before the cold could take hold. Her son stirred as warmth began to fill their small shelter. "Mother," his voice was weak, confused. "Where are we?" Naira smoothed his hair back, nodding with concern how cold his skin felt. "Somewhere safe," she lied. "Rest now, little one." She wrapped him in both thermal blankets, leaving none for herself. The cold immediately began to bite deeper, but she ignored it. The hours that followed were a blur of constant vigilance. Naira kept watch over both Kale and their surroundings, aware that they couldn't be the only life forms in this frozen wasteland. She rationed their nutrient packs carefully, knowing they needed to last as long as possible. The heat generator's power indicator dropped steadily, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. When Kale developed a fever despite her precautions, Naira felt real fear grip her heart. His genetic modifications had strengthened his immune system, but the cold was taking its toll. She used precious power from the heat generator to warm nutrient solution for him to drink, but he could barely keep it down. By the third day, the heat generator was nearly depleted. Naira had already stripped the pod's interior for anything burnable, creating small fires that offered more light than warmth. She found herself staring at her own thermal suit, calculating. The fabric was designed to trap heat, which meant it would burn. Her hands shook as she removed the outer layer of her suit. The cold hit her immediately, sharp enough to take her breath away, but she forced herself to focus on cutting the fabric into strips. Each piece went into the fire, burning with a chemical smell that made her eyes water. The heat it produced was minimal, but it was enough to bring some color back to Kale's cheeks. That night, as Kale slept fitfully beside her, Naira found herself thinking of home. Not the crystal spires of Zethra Prime, but her laboratory, where she had spent years studying the very genetic codes that had led to their exile. She wondered if her colleagues understood why she had done it, why she had broken their most sacred laws. Looking, the scanner in Marcus Reed's suit beeped insistently, drawing his attention away from the mineral samples he'd been collecting. He frowned at the readings, an energy signature that hadn't been there during yesterday's survey. Out here on Europa 459, new readings usually meant trouble. The moon's crust was unstable, prone to sudden geological shifts that could swallow an unwary surveyor whole. Marcus adjusted his suit's thermal settings, grateful for the advanced human technology that kept the killing cold at bay. 3 years of working these outer rim moons had taught him to respect their deadly beauty. The purple light of the gas giant overhead cast strange shadows across the ice fields, making every ridge and crevasse look like a potential threat. The energy signature pulsed again, stronger this time. Not geological, then something artificial. Marcus checked his oxygen levels, still good for another 6 hours, and began hiking toward the source. His heavy boots crunched through the icy crust with each step, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the thin atmosphere. The storm was picking up again, sheets of ice crystals reducing visibility to barely 20 meters. Marcus had almost missed the cave entrance, would have walked right past if his scanner hadn't chirped another alert. He played his suit lights across the opening, noticing how the ice had been disturbed recently. Someone or something had passed through here. "Base, this is Reed," he transmitted, knowing the signal would be weak this far out. "Got an anomalous reading, going to check it out." Static crackled back at him, broken by fragments of words. "Careful, predators, back up." "Copy that," he replied, though he doubted they could hear him clearly. "I'll maintain contact." The cave entrance was larger than it had first appeared, its walls smoothed by centuries of ice flow. Marcus moved cautiously, every sense alert. His suit's enhanced audio picked up something ahead, a rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. The thermal imaging in his visor showed 2 heat signatures, one significantly weaker than the other. He rounded a bend in the tunnel and stopped dead. In the pale light of a dying fire sat a figure unlike anything he'd seen in his years on the frontier. Humanoid, but clearly alien, silver-tinted skin, elegant ridge patterns along its temples. It's she, he realized, was hunched protectively over a smaller form, barely moving except to feed strips of what looked like clothing into the failing flames. The alien's head snapped up at his approach, eyes reflecting the firelight like a cat's. She moved with surprising speed, placing herself between him and what he now saw was a child. Her lips pulled back from sharp teeth in what was clearly a warning, but Marcus could see how she trembled from cold and exhaustion. He held up his hands slowly, trying to appear non-threatening despite his bulky environmental suit. "Easy," he said, knowing she probably couldn't understand him, but hopping his tone would convey his intentions. "I'm not here to hurt you." The alien woman's eyes narrowed, studying him with an intensity that made him wonder just how intelligent her species was. She spoke, her words musical but incomprehensible. One hand reached for what might have been a weapon, but the movement was weak, uncoordinated. The cold was killing her, Marcus realized. Her and the child both. Moving slowly, telegraphing his intentions, Marcus reached for his emergency pack. The alien tensed but didn't attack as he pulled out his spare thermal blanket. He held it out, making sure she could see it wasn't a weapon. "You need this more than I do." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm howled outside, and the child stirred weakly, making a sound that needed no translation pain. The alien's expression changed, fear warring with desperate need. Finally, she reached out with trembling fingers and took the blanket. She wrapped it immediately around the child, her movements gentle despite her obvious exhaustion. The relief in her eyes when the child's shivering began to ease was something Marcus understood perfectly. He'd seen that same look in his sister's eyes years ago when her daughter had been sick, the universal expression of a parent willing to do anything to protect their child. Marcus keyed his radio again. "Base, we've got a situation here. I've found survivors. Repeat, I've found survivors. They're not human and they need immediate medical assistance." This time the response was clearer. "Negative, Reed. Protocol states any alien contact must be cleared through command. Return to base immediately." Marcus looked at the alien mother, saw how she cradled her child, saw the strips of her own clothing she had burned to keep the little one alive. To hell with protocol. Some things transcended species. Sorry, base, he said, already reaching for his emergency shelter kit. You're breaking up. Can't hear you clearly. We'll report in when situation is stabilized. He turned back to the alien woman, who watched him with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. Slowly, carefully, he began setting up the portable shelter, its self-heating walls already beginning to glow with warmth. My name is Marcus, he said, pointing to himself, and I'm going to help you whether Command likes it or not. The alien woman seemed to understand, if not his words, then his actions. Some of the tension left her shoulders, though she kept her child close. She spoke again, a single word that might have been a name. Naira. Outside, the storm raged on, but in that frozen cave, something unprecedented was taking place. A moment of trust between two species who had never met, brought together by the most fundamental instinct in the universe, the drive to protect a child. The portable shelter hummed softly as its heating elements fought against the bitter cold. Marcus checked his datapad, mapping the safest route back to the research station. 20 kilometers across treacherous terrain, with a storm building and an injured child to transport. Not impossible, but far from ideal. Naira hadn't taken her eyes off him since he'd set up the shelter, watching his every movement with the wariness of a cornered animal. But necessity had forced a fragile trust between them. She had allowed him to examine her son Kale, she'd called him, and accepted the emergency rations he'd offered. The station has proper medical facilities, Marcus said, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hopping his tone conveyed reassurance. He pointed at Kale, then made walking motions with his fingers. We need to move before the storm gets worse. Naira tilted her head, the ridges along her temples shifting in what might have been comprehension. She spoke, her language flowing like liquid silver, then pointed at Kale and mimicked Marcus's walking gesture. Understanding achieved, if imperfectly. Preparing for the journey was an exercise in improvisation. Marcus's environmental suit was too large for Naira, but he was able to modify his backup thermal gear to fit her. Kale they wrapped in the emergency blankets, creating a secure bundle that could be carried between them. The moment they stepped out of the cave, the wind hit them like a physical blow. Ice crystals swirled through the air, reducing visibility to mere meters. Marcus took point, his suit's sensors mapping the safest path through the treacherous terrain. Naira followed close behind, cradling Kale against her chest. They had covered perhaps 2 kilometers when Marcus's motion detector pinged a warning. He raised his hand, signaling Naira to stop. Through the swirling snow, dark shapes moved with predatory grace, Europa 459's native hunters, drawn by the scent of potential prey. Ice stalkers, Marcus muttered, reaching slowly for the plasma rifle strapped to his back. He'd encountered the creatures before, pack hunters with razor-sharp claws and a particular fondness for warm-blooded prey. His suit's sensors counted 6 of them, circling closer. Naira had seen them too. She shifted Kale to one arm, her other hand moving to a small device at her hip that Marcus hadn't noticed before. Some kind of weapon. The stalkers were closing in, their low growls carrying through the thin atmosphere. The first attack came from the right, a blur of dark fur and gleaming claws. Marcus's rifle whined as it charged, but before he could fire, a burst of energy from Naira's device struck the creature. The stalker collapsed, its nervous system overloaded by the precise blast. Nice shot, Marcus said appreciatively. Naira might have smiled. It was hard to tell with her alien features, but her expression quickly turned to alarm as she pointed behind him. Marcus spun just in time to see another stalker lunging for his throat. His rifle came up, plasma bolt catching the creature in mid-leap. The rest of the pack attacked then, forcing them back to back. Naira's weapon crackled again and again, while Marcus's rifle filled the air with the scent of ozone and burned fur. When it was over, 4 stalkers lay dead in the snow, while the remaining 2 had fled into the storm. Marcus quickly checked his rifle's charge, still good for several more shots. Naira's weapon seemed to have fared worse, its power cell nearly depleted. They couldn't afford another fight like that. Marcus consulted his map, looking for an alternate route. There, an old survey tunnel, part of the initial expedition's infrastructure. It would add distance to their journey, but it would get them out of the storm and away from the stalkers. Getting Naira's attention, he pointed toward a barely visible metal structure protruding from the ice. She understood immediately, nodding her agreement. The tunnel's entrance was partially collapsed, but they managed to squeeze through. Inside, the air was still brutally cold, but at least they were out of the wind. Emergency lights still functioned along the ceiling, casting everything in a pale blue glow. Marcus checked his oxygen levels, still sufficient, but they'd need to be careful. They paused to rest, sharing what remained of Marcus's emergency rations. Cale was conscious but weak, his silver skin having taken on a worrying gray tinge. Naira stroked his head, singing softly in her musical language. Marcus found himself studying them as he ate. Everything he'd been taught about first contact protocols said he should maintain his distance, avoid emotional involvement. But watching Naira tend to her son with such gentle devotion, he couldn't help but see past their alien features to the fundamentally human emotions they displayed. A distant rumble made them both tense. Marcus checked his sensors, not stalkers this time, but something potentially worse. The moon's unstable geology was acting up again. They needed to move. "Come on," he said, standing and offering Naira his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then took it, allowing him to help her up. The simple gesture felt significant somehow, a bridge between their species built on trust and necessity. They had covered another kilometer through the tunnel when the next tremor hit, stronger this time. Cracks appeared in the ceiling, ancient ice groaning under the stress. Marcus's sensors screamed a warning. The whole section was about to collapse. Without thinking, he grabbed Naira and Cale, pushing them ahead of him as the tunnel began to cave in. They ran through the darkness, ice crashing down behind them. Marcus's suit lights flickered, threatening to fail, but they kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. Finally, they burst through an emergency exit, emerging onto the surface just as the tunnel collapsed completely. They stood there in the howling wind, covered in ice crystals and breathing heavily. Naira looked at Marcus, then down at where his hand still gripped her arm. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her own hand over his, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. The storm was beginning to ease, and in the distance, Marcus could see the lights of the research station. They were more than halfway there, but the hardest part of their journey still lay ahead. Not just the physical challenge of reaching safety, but the bigger challenge of what would happen when they arrived. Marcus knew the protocols, knew what command would say about harboring alien refugees, but looking at Naira and Cale, he also knew he couldn't abandon them now. Some choices transcended protocol, transcended species. Sometimes you had to trust your humanity over your training. The research station's perimeter lights cut through the gloom like beacons, promising warmth and safety. But as Marcus and Naira approached, his suit's radio crackled to life with an urgent warning that shattered any hope of a simple resolution. "Read, this is command. We're picking up an unidentified vessel entering orbit. Energy signatures match nothing in our database. Respond immediately." Marcus's heart sank. He knew what this meant. The Zethurians had found them. Naira must have realized it too. Her posture changed, becoming more rigid, and she pulled Cale closer to her chest. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else there too, determination. "This is Reed," he responded, knowing he had to make a choice now. "I'm approaching the station with 2 refugees. They need immediate medical attention." He paused, then added firmly, "And they need our protection." "Negative, Reed. First contact protocols are clear. We cannot interfere in alien cultural affairs. The vessel is hailing us. They're demanding the return of their criminals." Marcus looked at Naira, who stood straight despite her exhaustion. She wasn't a criminal, she was a mother who had dared to save her child. He made his decision. "Command, with respect, they're not criminals. They're refugees from a society that would let a child die rather than allow genetic treatment. I've seen their strength, their courage. If we turn them away, we're no better than those who exiled them." The station's massive doors began to open, and Dr. Alina Torres, the station's chief medical officer, rushed out with a medical team. She took one look at Cale's condition and immediately began barking orders, ignoring Command's continued protests over the comm. Get them to Medical Bay 3, Elena ordered, her dark eyes flashing with professional intensity. And someone get me xenobiology on the line. We've got a hypothermic alien child here. Inside the station, warmth enveloped them like a blessing, but they had little time to appreciate it. Alarms began blaring throughout the facility. The Zethurian ship was demanding immediate docking access. Station Director Chen's voice came over the intercom, tense but controlled. All personnel, this is not a drill. We have a first contact situation combined with a potential diplomatic incident. Security teams to your stations. In the medical bay, Elena worked swiftly to stabilize Kale, her movements sure despite the unprecedented nature of her patient. Naira watched every procedure with anxious attention, while Marcus stood guard at the door, his rifle ready. Their ship is entering atmosphere, Chen reported. Reed, we need those aliens out of here now. We're not equipped for an interspecies conflict. Marcus looked at Naira, who was speaking softly to her now conscious son. Kale's color had improved dramatically under Elena's care, his silver skin regaining its healthy sheen. He wouldn't let them be taken. Director, he said, an idea forming, get me a channel to their ship. Moments later, he faced a video screen showing Commander Vex, his silver features twisted with barely contained rage. You harbor criminals, the Zethurian stated. Return them or face the consequences. These criminals are under human protection, Marcus replied, standing tall. Your laws don't apply here, but I'm willing to offer a compromise. He outlined his proposal quickly. The research station would share their medical database, showing how genetic therapy could save lives without compromising species integrity. In return, Naira's exile would be commuted, and she would help bridge the gap between their species, using her scientific knowledge to benefit both societies. You dare to lecture us on genetics? Vex sneered. We have spent millennia perfecting our bloodlines. And how many children have died for that perfection? Marcus challenged. Look at Kale, he's stronger now, not weaker. Change doesn't have to mean destruction. A new voice joined the conversation, Naira's, speaking in halting English words she must have been learning from the station's translation matrix. Our people fear change, Commander, but fear kills more surely than any mutation. I chose life for my son. Let others have that choice. Long moments passed as Vex considered her words. Finally, his rigid posture softened slightly. The Council will need convincing. Then let us convince them, Naira said, together. The negotiations that followed were complex, stretching over days as both sides worked to find common ground. The research station became a neutral zone where humans and Zethurians could meet, learn, and slowly begin to understand each other. Kale recovered fully, his genetic modifications proving to be an asset rather than a weakness. He became a living example of how change could strengthen rather than diminish, his presence helping to soften centuries of Zethurian prejudice. Months later, Marcus stood with Naira in the station's observation dome, watching the gas giant's storms paint purple shadows across the ice. Kale played nearby with the station children, their laughter bridging the gap between species more effectively than any diplomatic agreement. Was it worth it, he asked quietly, leaving everything behind? Naira touched the pendant at her neck, no longer a reminder of loss, but a symbol of transformation. Some journeys, she said in her now fluent English, take us far from home so we can find a better one. Outside, the eternal storm raged on, but within the station, something new was growing. A future where different species could learn from each other, where a mother's love could change not just one life, but the course of two civilizations. Marcus smiled, remembering that first moment in the cave when he'd chosen to help rather than follow protocol. Sometimes the most human choice was to reach across the void, to offer warmth in the coldest dark. Sometimes saving one child could save so much more.